This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm Dahlia Shendlin.
And I'm Gilad Halpern.
Every week we bring you conversations with authors about their books and research and other things that we find fascinating and essential. If you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage. That's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us. We're counting on you. This episode is brought to you by the Israel Democracy Institute, an independent center of research and action dedicated to strengthening the foundations of Israeli democracy.
Today we are happy to welcome back to the show Amichai Cohen, is professor of law at Ono Academic College and a senior fellow at the Israel Democracy Institute. His new book, entitled The Constitutional Revolution and Counter-Revolution, was published only in Hebrew in 2020 by Dvir and the Israel Democracy Institute. Professor Amichai Cohen, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So the Constitutional Revolution has entered the Israeli political lingo in the 1990s and is largely associated with the passage in the Knesset of two basic laws and, more importantly, with the increased weight that the judicial system has given to basic laws as opposed to regular laws. Maybe you can start by briefly explaining what the Constitutional Revolution is exactly, and to what extent is it really a revolution rather than a natural progression of the Israeli legal tradition.
So the Constitutional Revolution is a term coined by Aharon Barak, who was president of the Israeli Supreme Court for many years, in a famous decision of the court, the United Mizrahi Bank judgment of 1995. And what Barak meant was that the Knesset, as a constituent power, decided to enact two basic laws that gave the court the ability to strike down regular laws which infringe on the rights that are protected in these basic laws. Now, Barak did not mean a revolution in the sense that there were no basic laws before. There were basic laws before. And in fact, Barak went to pains to present his position as a conservative one. Said he is building on precedents from the 1960s where the court already struck down laws of the Knesset.
Laws or one law?
There were a couple of decisions, mainly one, all of them around laws concerning election law and election funding laws.
So procedural things.
You could say it's procedural. I'll explain in a second why I don't think it was actually procedural. So Barak used the term constitutional revolution more as a way to perhaps gain attention or present his position. What he meant was it's the first time that the Knesset decided to give protection to human rights, as opposed to the earlier basic laws, which dealt with elections and institutions within Israeli democracy. What Barak did not say, and he was criticized for it a lot, was the fact that the laws did not include, or any law in Israel until now does not include any explicit statement that the court can strike down laws. It is a conclusion that Barak drew. Now, of course, the Israeli Supreme Court is not the first court that said, even though there is no specific law that says that the court has a right, the United States Supreme Court, in the famous Marbury versus Madison decision, was perhaps almost 2 centuries earlier said the same thing, and other courts in Argentina, in Norway, other courts around the world have said the same. But in Israel, he was attacked for usurpation of power. It's part of a larger claim that the court has become an actor in Israeli politics and has taken a place which he should not have taken. Part of what I call the counter-revolution is trying to turn back the clock and take away from the court the power which I'm saying Barak, but of course the justices of the Israeli Supreme Court have taken to themselves without any explicit statement of the Knesset.
Who were the immediate discontents with this innovation of the court rejecting laws of the Knesset?
I think, and this is one of the things I'm presenting in the book, that actually when it was said in 1995, it was not so much something in debate. I mean, people said that, well, we're not sure that the Knesset gave you the power, but this was not a major political issue when the decision was handed down in 1995. And the reason is that people understood that in the early 1990s, there was actually a constitutional revolution, but not the one which we now speak about. There was a different constitutional revolution. And the different constitutional revolution was the enactment of the law of direct election of prime minister. Now, what happened, I explain in the book, and I don't want to go into a long, detailed history of Israeli politics here, but somewhere in the end of the 1980s, beginning of the 1990s, there was a public feeling that the Israeli politics are stuck.
I can't imagine why.
Much like today. And there was, perhaps I would even say, a craving for something to change. And the change that the Knesset enacted was to change the electoral system in Israel to direct elections of a prime minister. We had this for less than a decade, from 1996 to 2003. These were the times. But it was enacted in 1992. And as part of it, because the members of the Knesset, which understood that by enacting this revolution, they give a lot of power to the executive branch, because the prime minister becomes a very strong person, much like close perhaps to the president, to a president, right?
Because
direct election is directly elected. Then they understood that they have to balance this power in some way. And the way to balance it was passing these basic laws which deal with protection of human rights. So giving power to the executive, balancing it with power, and to the courts. It's okay. So you have a balance, separation of powers. The executive becomes stronger. Then you need a stronger limitation, and it's the Supreme Court. It was actually quite consensual. It wasn't like there was... People did not feel that the court was taking undue power.
But even regardless of the law to elect the direct election of a prime minister, there seems to me that in Israel there is already a great deal of power within the hands of the executive, taking into account the absence of a formal constitution, so there's really nothing to measure the laws against, and also the fact that Israel, the Knesset, is a unicameral system, and you also detail in the book, like there's a nice table.
Graph. I love this graph, because you have a number of the kinds of protections that we find in other countries.
That don't exist in Israel.
So let's divide the discussion to formal divisions of power and informal divisions of power. So in most countries, I would say this: in no liberal democracy, there is a single unitary institution which can make decisions by simple majorities, which is directly elected. So no regional elections, etc. And I'm pointing here to several issues. So what we have in Israel is the Knesset, and formally, Israel is the only elected institution in Israel which has power over the entire country. And if you take out the basic laws and the Supreme Court, there is no other limit. So the Knesset can basically pass any law it wants, and it needs no other institution to approve it. In every other liberal democracy, there is some other institution that limits the power of the legislative to enact laws in simple majorities. So, take, for example, the United States. So, there is the veto power of the president. There are a bicameral system, right? So there is a division of power between the federal system and the states. The states have powers that are constitutionally protected, so the federal system cannot enact anything it wants. There are regional elections, so the representatives in Congress are parts of a party, but they are also respondent to their own constituents in their own states. Many countries are part of some kind of regional institutions. So, for example, the European Union. So there are limitations on what can be accepted. So, politically, I'm saying, not taking out of the description the courts, politically, in every other liberal democracy that we know today, there is no single legislative body which can accept decisions without any other political institutions having to approve it. So Israel is the unique example of such kind of a body, and I can explain why in New Zealand there are limitations, etc. But even if so perhaps New Zealand. Okay, now informally, and here I would say there were limitations on the power of the Knesset, informal limitations, basically two. One was the Histadrut, the biggest labor union in Israel, which was a very strong institution until the 1980s. And actually, the Knesset could not pass economic laws in Israel without taking into account the position of the Histadrut. The Histadrut lost almost all its power in the 1980s for many reasons. So these informal limitations went out. Second was the parties. The party system in Israel was very strong until the 1980s. People went, their medical services were provided by HMOs which belonged to parties. People read newspapers which belonged to parties. A young person went to youth movements which belonged to parties. The party system was a community system. It was very strong. And it was a limitation on the power of the Knesset. You had to go through the party. Because of the direct election laws, the parties lost all their powers. Because what people said is, if I already vote for a direct election for a leader, then I can use my other vote. I won't vote to my traditional party. I vote to some very small party, and the party system broke down. So both the informal limitations that were in the Israeli political system also broke down in the 1980s. What we are left with, beginning in the 1990s and through, I would say, 2020, is a very weak legislative body, completely controlled by the government, and actually not even the government, a small group within the government, which are the leaders of the parties. So Yair Lapid completely controls 17 votes in the Knesset, and no one can even criticize his position. The same goes for Netanyahu. He completely controls. And so a very small group of persons has complete control over the Israeli political system. This is an event that has no comparison in any other liberal democracy that we know of. We don't know any other liberal democracy that has this political system.
So it goes almost without saying that the High Court should have as many powers as possible to limit the powers of the
natural evolution. You are completely correct. The natural evolution of the Israeli political system is that because a small group of persons has so much political power, there is a need to balance this power. It's something I would say that when Madison thought about the American Constitution, this was his basic anxiety. How can we limit the power that a small group of persons will not control the entire political system? And then separation of powers, right? This idea of we need to separate the powers and his ideas. So it's a natural evolution.
So why is it that in Israeli discourse today, everywhere you turn and everywhere you look and every newspaper you open, with few exceptions, you will hear very commonly the following refrain, which is that the judiciary has burst out of its limitations and it has grabbed for itself power and it has enacted a coup over society and trampled the will of the people? How is that such a prominent and prevalent concept?
Okay, so there are, I think, 3 reasons for it. The first is that many decisions of the Israeli Supreme Court, and this has to do with the fact that the Israeli right has been in power for many years, on and off, but in very short intervals of center or center-left control, mostly right-wing control. So naturally, the Israeli Supreme Court, it won't strike down laws that are not passed. So you only strike down laws that are passed by the majority. So every court in the world finds itself in contradiction with the controlling political system because it protects the minority against the majority. The majority passes laws. It does not need the court. The court is needed by the minority. The fact that there is such a long term of right-wing control was, perhaps until very recently, was such a long term, means that there were a lot of incidents where the court struck down laws that the majority. So the majority has a political will and incentive to criticize the court and to attack it. That's the first thing. The second, and perhaps here it's deeper, and it's that part of what is going on in the Israeli political system, mostly the Israeli right, but not only, is and it's not a unique Israeli phenomenon, is the advance of the populist theory. And a lot of what populists speak about is the control of the majority. So once you are elected and you have the majority, there should be no limitations to your power. Now, I am sorry to say that we are seeing in the recent 2 weeks that even the current administration in Israel has adopted some of these rules of the game. So once I have a majority that I can do whatever I want, quick changes for very small, I would say, political reasons of basic laws. Basic laws are changed, without.
But we should remember that some of the people currently in the government, including the prime minister, come straight out of that right-wing populist camp.
Okay, so here is a definition of populist here is very difficult. And so that's the second reason. The second reason is that any limitation by a court is seen by populists as illegitimate because you put limitations on the power of the majority. We were elected, so no limitation. And the third reason is that, and here I have to say, the court should take some responsibility for its actions. So I want to say something in an introductory manner. The average time life of a constitution in liberal democracies around the world is something in the area of 25 years. So the US Constitution is unique in the sense that basically there is the same constitution for almost 250 years. This is very unique. Most constitutions are much more short-lived. So perhaps it's time, if we have the same system from 1995, perhaps there came a time where the people want to change something. Now, the main question, I think, for the court is whether its decisions in some way support the fact that the people want to change, or whether it goes against a will of the people to change some of the parts of the constitutions. And here is my criticism, perhaps, of the court. The court has invested a lot of judicial time in dealing with protection of human rights. It has spent, until perhaps the recent year or 2 years, very little time in asking itself, what should be the institutional arrangement in Israel? How should we change the constitution? What is the correct balance between the government and the Knesset?
But isn't that for the legislature to decide, even in its sitting as a constituent assembly?
The legislature has decided, but the court has never gone into it as an interpreter of the basic law. It has almost never said, I'll give you an example. Can the government privatize private prisons? The court analyzed this question as a human rights question. It never analyzed it as the question of what is the role of the government, what should be part of the government power, and what should not. In the recent years, the court has attempted to go into this question in several decisions. For example, in forcing the Knesset to vote on a chairperson of the Knesset about a year ago. The court forced and it's a precedent. And the court said, listen, we are not sure about this is new terrain for us. We are not sure what we're doing here. This is a part of the Constitution that the court has never gone into. It's part of its role to say we have a separation of powers, what exactly is the constitutional arrangement, and if you don't like it, you can change it. But it has never been very clear about this issue.
It seems like, these three reasons are, that you have a fundamental disagreement with them. And you recognize perhaps the merit for the pragmatic reasons of them, of course, as you say, because it's a right-wing government and automatically the court would support, in inverted commas, left-wing causes, and perhaps, 25 years, it's time to move on, etc. I'd like to ask you, the more, say, scholarly or intellectual critics of the constitutional revolution, I'm thinking of perhaps Professor Daniel Friedman, the former legal scholar and the former justice minister that you quote in the book several times. Do you see any fundamental merit in some of the more, perhaps, highbrow opposition to the constitutional revolution?
So Daniel Friedman perhaps is not an excellent example.
How about Ruth Gabizon?
Okay. So Ruth Gabizon is better, and of course she can't answer, so I can't say what. And
our listeners may not know that she did pass away.
Yes, I'm sorry about it. So there are three claims, perhaps. One claim is that the court took power that it was never given. I think this is the Friedman thesis. I don't agree with it. I don't think it's...
And you refute it in the book.
I don't think... I think in 1995, the court was given the power to strike down legislation based on these basic laws.
By the Knesset.
By the Knesset. But the Knesset understood what it was doing. It was intentional. It has... The question... so this claim, I don't think... But the question is now. So the current... if I could use the term, constitution of the Israeli public right now, is it the correct way for the current Israeli public that you have this very strong government and a court, the only institution that can limit it is the court? Perhaps not. I think not. I think in the past generation, the public in Israel has changed a lot on many issues, changed its view. And I think perhaps it's time to rethink the way the political system is constituted. So perhaps more powers should be given to municipalities. I'll give you an example. The Israeli public now is much more, it's much more in controversies, the issues of religion and state. Power to municipalities means that people living in Tel Aviv could very well have different ways of thinking, of ways of life than people in Jerusalem. And if you devolve the power from the center to the municipalities, then perhaps many of the issues that are currently decided by the Knesset and automatically go to the Supreme Court, because that's the only way that the minority can protect its position is by going to the Supreme Court. Maybe some of these issues should be decided based on regional interests and not, you shouldn't have some general interests. So I agree with the criticism in the sense that perhaps it's time to rethink the way that the Israeli political system is built, and then perhaps not every disagreement will automatically be at the court. It's perhaps the court has the authority or the legitimacy to decide some controversies, but of course, if every political controversy comes to the court, then naturally it undermines its legitimacy, because in court you have a winner and a loser. And if you have a winner and a loser, then the loser has claims and against the court. So it's not a good thing that all these controversies come to the court. And because the Israeli public has a lot more controversies now than it used to have in many, many issues, then perhaps we should find some ways to deal with these controversies without getting to them.
But I do want to bring this to a different level, because Gilad asked the question about what is the dispute over the system, how the system works, and that's what we've been talking about. But is this debate truly only about the nature of democracy, politics, and law, or is it really about specific policy positions that the right wing, which has been mostly in power, would like to advance? And what I'm basically trying to say is, if the judgments of the court were less liberal, more religious, more pro-settlement, maybe more pro-annexation, would we be having this conversation? Would the government be saying, oh, the court intervenes too much? Is it really about them wanting to advance a particular policy or set of policies?
So in the book, I try to open also specific issues. When you speak about specific issues, there are, I think, 4 areas where you can say, okay, here is a controversy that came to the court and the court decided something. The first one is asylum seekers. Actually, I think it's not such an important issue. It became important politically because political parties wanted to gain power by speaking about asylum seekers. But it's not actually a fundamental problem in Israeli reality. And this is an area where the court struck down 3 times the attempt of the Knesset to limit. But actually, the executive managed to limit the power of the numbers of incoming asylum seekers dramatically in the recent decades. So it's actually okay. The second issue is religion and state. Here there is issues of religion and state. The main problem in religion and state is that the Knesset refuses to make decisions. This is a political stalemate. We have these sayings, the status quo, right? Everything remains as it was. Now, of course, it's impossible that decisions that were taken in the 1940s will be realistically implemented to issues of the 21st century. So there was no discussion of same-sex marriage in the 1940s. So where do you go with the status quo on these issues? And so all these issues, the court is making decisions, but it almost never strikes down a law because there is no law. And if there is a law, it's an arcane law from the Turkish period or from the British period. So these are not areas. The court here takes decisions which might or might not be against the will of the majority in the Knesset, but actually the Knesset avoids these issues completely, attempts, and it's impossible. And any court would have to deal because people come with problems and the Knesset refuses to deal with the problems. So this is the second issue. The third issue is the service in the army of the ultra-Orthodox community. Here the court has struck down the arrangements that the Knesset has attempted. There is a discussion in the book. I don't know if we have time. I don't think we have time to go into it. I have a different... I think what the court is trying to do in these issues is keep the issue alive in public debate. It's a question of political debate. The ultra-Orthodox in Israel attempt to take this issue and move it away from public debate. They have always attempted it because it's an uneasy issue for them. How come every Jewish Israeli youngster serves for 2.5 or 3 years in the army, and ultra-Orthodox men and women do not serve? So they try to take it away from public decision, and what the court does basically is keep it within public decision. I think this is what the court is doing here. But you can criticize the court for its decisions here, but I think you have to understand what the court is trying to do. It's not making policy here. It's not saying, listen, you have to enlist it's saying you have to come to some reasonable conclusion, arrangement, and you have to debate about it and think about what you are going to do. And there is much more to say about this issue. So here we come to your question, and maybe it's about the settlements, annexation. Now, in fact, if you can say anything about the decisions of the Israeli Supreme Court in this area, is that the court has supported the policy of the consecutive Israeli governments throughout the years on almost every issue. So what people are speaking about are evacuation of illegal settlements. You are speaking in past 20 years, less than 100 families were evacuated by court decision. This is the number. This is what we're speaking about. The court has consistently supported the policies of the government. Now, there is an attempt to say, well, but the government has self-imposed limitations on itself because it worried that the court would do something else.
Like a chilling effect, I think you call it.
Yes, chilling effect. And there was one decision from a year ago regarding the settlement regulation law in which the court did strike down a specific law, but actually if you go into it, it approved a lot of other, by striking down, when striking down the law, it actually approved a lot of what the law attempted to gain. So the issues where you start looking at the specific issues, I think you can't evade the conclusion that it's a principled issue and not so much a specific issues. Governments don't like limitations. And it's not important if it's a right-wing or a left-wing government. The current government would not like limitations too. And what can we do? In order to have a working liberal democracy, you need to put some kind of limitations on the power of the ruling majority. It's part of the game.
I was just going to remind our listeners that one of the people who was most against the limitation of a constitution was David Ben-Gurion.
Exactly. David Ben-Gurion. Okay. Let's not talk into it.
But I mean, if that was considered left at the time, he was left-wing in Israeli.
Yeah, well, he wasn't not exactly left.
But in the Israeli spectrum and consciousness, and he didn't want limitations.
Let's leave him in his grave. Maybe it's time, to start concluding by talking about the way out of all this. And this one suggestion is a basic law on legislation, a way to arrange this unarranged sort of uncharted waters. And maybe you can talk about it and perhaps refer to the system of basic laws. You talked about it earlier in passing about how it's sort of a sham, right? Israbluff, as we call it in Israel. That still, basic laws are basic laws, supposed to be, a sort of an introduction or a prelude to a constitution. Yet, whenever some sort of short-lived political interest arises, they are hacked and mangled.
Yes. So it's interesting to see that the first action of the first Israeli elected legislative was an unconstitutional action. This was elected not at the first Knesset, they were elected as a constitutional assembly. And the first decision was, we cannot form a constitution, we are turning ourselves into the first Knesset, to a legislative body. They were never elected to be a legislative body. They were elected to be a constitutional assembly. Anyway, the compromise there was that indeed the Knesset will be a regular legislative body, but will also enact basic laws, which are the draft, I would say, to a future constitution. Barak thinks that, and this is the holding of the Israeli Supreme Court, they already have some kind of power. They are more important hierarchically than the regular legislation, these basic laws. But they are enacted in a way which is similar to enacting regular legislation by simple majority. And it's just that you have a heading, it's now basic law.
And if they're not entrenched, they could be overturned by the same
Exactly,
majority.
and they can. Some of them are entrenched, but entrenched in Israeli lingo is very much different than entrenched in any other constitution. Every other constitution, when you say entrenched, you mean you need a 2/3 majority, like in the States. You need also agreement by the states. No, you need 61 of 120. In most cases, there are 2 or 3 clauses that need a larger majority.
As opposed to just a simple majority.
Yes, but so for example, if you want to delay the elections for more than 4 years, then you need an 80 members of the Knesset to agree. But apart from this, it's very easy to change them. And this is what is done now in two recent governments that were formed in Israel, the 2020 government, the 2021 government. They had a problem. They needed an alternate prime minister. So they changed the basic law and they said, now we have a new institution, simple majority, very quick. They did it within 2 or 3 days. It was very important because you need to form a government. They changed the basic law and here we have an alternate prime minister, a new institution, very quick. So this needs to change. If we want to take the basic law seriously, you need to put stronger limitations. And stronger limitations are not only in terms of numbers. It's not only a question of, okay, you need 70 or 80. It's also time frame. So perhaps this was a suggestion by the late Yaakov Ne'eman, who was Minister of Justice 20 years ago. He said maybe you have to wait an election. So you need to vote on it and then after the next election, vote on it again, approve it again. So you can see that there is a real majority for it, and it's not just something. And the second issue is the override clause. So, and this is the strongest now, I think, in political discussion in Israel. So, allow the government to override decisions of the court, striking down specific laws. Here again, so say the government passes a law, and the court strikes it down. It says it infringes on some right that is protected by the basic laws. And so the idea of the override clause is that the government the Knesset could reenact it and say, we know that the court said it infringes, but nevertheless, we want it enacted. That's the idea. And there is an example in his basic law, freedom of occupation. There is an override clause. It was used once and in the entire history. it has a time limit for 4 years, and it can be reenacted. So for 4 years, and so that's the political idea, and it's some kind of compromise or solution. Now the question is, what will be God is in the details. So what will be the safer? I don't oppose the override clause in principle as a political solution to this discussion. So say we'll have basic law legislation saying explicitly, yes, the court has a right to strike down laws. And then on the other hand, the Knesset has the ability to override. In what majority? So will 61 members of Knesset will be enough? Perhaps the time frame. So what about the idea that you have the ability, but only after the next election, so people could understand what they are voting for? Perhaps you could limit the number of times that the Knesset, this is another suggestion that has been floated, that you could limit the number of times that the Knesset can use the override clause in any specific Knesset. So 3 or 4 times override. So there are many ideas about it, and there is room for discussion and compromise here. It's uncharted terrain, and perhaps there will be some kind of solution here.
We have to wrap up pretty soon. I want to ask you one final question, I think, unless Gilad has any more afterwards, which is that, the Israel Democracy Index survey that comes out annually shows that not only is support for the Supreme Court or trust in the Supreme Court declining, but the most striking thing to me is the polarization. The left and the center support it at very high rates, the right wing much less. And one of the theses of your book, one of your arguments, is that there is a way to bridge the gap between conservative and activist approaches, or maybe you would say conservative and liberal approaches. How do you characterize the way to bridge that, the arguments for an active and substantial role for the court with the conservative criticism?
So, 2 things. First, as I said before, perhaps take some issues off the table of the court. So, for example, if you authorized municipalities to have more issues dealt in municipalities, less issues will be brought to the court for decisions and maybe this will bring down the tension somewhat, and then bring up the trust. And the second point is that I think the court should explicitly say, and not implicitly as it does now, but explicitly say, we are about the protection of the democratic system, of the separation of powers, of the institutional formation of the Israeli democracy. We are not about decision of values in Israel. And explain why. And perhaps in some issues, if you want to be trusted, then in some issues, the court should say, listen, okay, so this is a value issue. Perhaps it won't deal with it. On the other hand, issues that the court has avoided because it said, well, listen, it's not exactly rights. It's more arrangement of the country. The court should deal with them. And I think a move from only human rights speak, which was appropriate in the 1990s, but perhaps it's less appropriate now, towards a more perhaps procedural but institutional way of framing the decision will contribute.
Right, on this rather optimistic note that I have to say I did not quite expect, I'd like to thank you, Professor Amichai Cohen of the Israel Democracy Institute, a senior fellow there and professor of law at Ono Academic College. We discussed things related to your new book published last year called The Constitutional Revolution and Counter-Revolution. It came out only in Hebrew, hopefully sometime soon in English as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And many thanks to Itai Shelem, our station manager, and Ariel Cohen, our producer, and of course to the Israel Democracy Institute for their generous support. And now we've got a request because most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review of any kind. You too can support us by going to our website, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribe to our Patreon campaign. Please check out our archive. It has well over 600 interviews. Like us on Facebook, follow me and Dalia and the Tel Aviv Review podcast on Twitter. And of course, join us again next week for for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from Dalia and from me, goodbye.